So, I wanted to begin my comments tonight. I decided I wanted to quote something that was written back in 1892. It was written by a very radical socialist back in 1892, and he hoped that by reciting these words, people all over the country would start reciting these phrases, and they'd start saying them, and that this could be the basis for a mass movement in the United States that would totally reorient the economic system to work in the interest of the people of the country, and would also get rid of racism. So, are you ready for these very radical words that were written back in 1892 by a very, very radical socialist?
Yeah.
Well, I think they're quite familiar to folks here in the room. They go like this. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So I bet you didn't know that Francis Bellamy, the author of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance, was a socialist. He was actually a socialist. He was a Baptist minister. He was a Baptist minister in Boston, and his sermons were so radical that they were actually, he was banned from the pulpit. He wasn't allowed to preach in the city of Boston, so he moved to Florida. And he had a bit of a problem because he refused to preach to segregated congregations. He didn't believe in racism and segregation, so he couldn't preach in Florida either, so it's an interesting history. But you know, Francis Bellamy, the author of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance, he wasn't the only radical socialist in U.S. history. Abraham Lincoln, in the Union Army, he had a general, August Willock, a brigadier general in the Army, who was leading soldiers into battle. And throughout the entire war, he was corresponding directly with Karl Marx and getting advice and instruction from Karl Marx about how to wage the Civil War. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt openly met at the White House with the League Against War and Fascism and the founders of the Congress for Industrial Organizations. He worked with the unemployment councils. And you know, they've done polls in the USA, and the two most beloved presidents that we've ever had are Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I think it's not a coincidence that those are the two presidents that have the most friendly and the most open relationship with people who think like us, with leftists and socialists. So that's something to keep in mind. You know, there's nothing un-American about socialism. There's no reason that you can't be in this country and believe in socialism. They've done so much to convince us that our whole identity as Americans is based on the free market. And that's false. We have a whole other history. And when we have socialism in the United States, we are not going to have Korean socialism, Russian socialism, Cuban socialism, Venezuelan socialism, Norwegian or Swedish socialism. The only type of socialism that we're ever going to have here in the United States is going to be American socialism. It's going to be a socialism rooted in the progressive and democratic struggles that have taken place on this very soil. A lot of ugly, awful things have happened in the history of the United States of America. Jim Crow segregation, racism, but there's a whole other side to the American people. While every single one of these injustices was taking place, there were people who were actively struggling against them. And that spirit, that democratic history of struggle that you can find in American history, that's going to be the basis for building a new country in the United States. Now, in order to help explain that point, I'm actually going to read to you from a document that was written 90 years ago on the other side of the planet. I'm about to read to you from this document, and at the time that this document was written, it's very likely that barely anyone read it. And it was not something people were reading everywhere. It was kind of obscure. But 30 years later, the whole world was reading it. And I'm convinced that 500 years from now, when people are studying how one of the poorest countries in the world became one of the wealthiest countries in the world, they're going to be reading this document to try and understand it. These are the words that played a very pivotal role in the history of the largest country in the world in terms of population. Several 100 million peasants will rise like a mighty storm, like a hurricane, a force so swift that no power, however great, will be able to hold it back. They will smash the trammels that bind them and rush forward along the road to liberation. They will sweep away the imperialists, warlords, corrupt officials, local tyrants, and evil gentry into their graves. A revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing an embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, and courteous, restrained and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection in which one class overthrows another. All those whom the gentry have despised, those who have been downtrodden into the dirt, people with no place in society, people with no right to speak, have now audaciously lifted up their heads. They have not only lifted up their heads, but they have taken power into their own hands. Now, what I'm reading to you is from this document, and it's called Report on an Investigation of the Peasant Movement in Hunan. It was written in 1927 by a very obscure and unknown figure in Chinese politics at that time by the name of Mao Zedong. And this document was written because in the rural parts of China, peasants were rising up and killing their landlords. And they sent Mao Zedong, because he himself had grown up in the countryside, he was from a middle peasant, wealthy family, they sent him to investigate what was going on, to report on it. And he wrote this glowing report, which I'll get back to later. But why were these peasants so poor in China back in 1927? Now, the way that we're taught to think about politics in the United States and to think about the world, we're taught to think that some countries are just naturally poor countries, right? There's some countries that are naturally rich, like Western Europe and the USA, and there are some countries that are naturally poor, like, Asia, Africa, Latin America. These are poor countries, these are rich countries, that's just how it is. Well, that's false. Do you know who invented gunpowder? The Chinese. Who had the first paper money? That was China. At the time that my ancestors were living in caves in Europe, in Western Europe, the people in China had a vibrant civilization. They had invented the world's first civil service examination. China was poor back in 1927 because Wall Street bankers and London bankers were keeping China poor. Now, I know there's got to be some American history buffs here in the audience, right? Now, if you're someone who's studied the history of the United States, you're quite familiar with something called the East India Company. Anyone familiar with the East India Company, right? That's the Boston Tea Party. That's back in 1776, or in the lead up to the American Revolution. The East India Company, a huge British corporation, had essentially a forced monopoly on the importation of tea. So the American colonists, they went out and they dumped that tea into the ocean, right? Very famous, the Boston Tea Party. Well, at the time that this document was written, the East India Company was hugely invested in China and had a huge monopoly in the Chinese markets. In fact, and it's interesting, one of the biggest entities on Wall Street today is what's called HSBC Bank. And that's a British bank, but what does HSBC stand for? Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. This was an entity created by the London Stock Exchange in order to dominate the Chinese economy. And one of the main things that HSBC Bank was involved in doing was importing narcotics, opium, heroin into China as a way of subduing the people and drugging them and making them easier to dominate and conquer. And there were two wars fought by the British in order to maintain their monopoly and their control over the Chinese economy. What were they called? They were the two Opium Wars, right? These were wars forcing China to accept the importation of narcotics. Can you believe this, right? Forcing a country to accept the importation of narcotics. Now, the first time the U.S. troops were sent to China, the first time that happened, that was in 1900. And in China at that point, there was an uprising. They called it the Boxer Rebellion. The way American media portrayed it, it was to protect missionaries, and it was, Christians were being persecuted, and they didn't want to intervene, but they just had to. We've heard this song and dance. Every time there's a war, the USA is always going in to liberate and protect people. But the reality was they were going in to protect the drug dealers from the nationalist movement. We all know about that comment Donald Trump made, right? About I'm not going to repeat it. I was brought up, my understanding is that you never talk that way about someone's home. We're talking about, the blank hole countries, if you know what I'm saying. You don't talk that way about someone's home. No matter how much problems a country has, no matter how poor the people there are, the people who live there are still people, and you don't disrespect them, and you don't use language like that to describe their home country. But if you look at all these countries around the world that are being described that way, they all have economies that are dominated by Wall Street and London. I mean, look at Mexico, for example. Every day there are people trying to cross in from Mexico. Mexico is a totally free market country. They privatized their oil recently, but it was only nominally nationalized prior to that. The country's totally gone along with NAFTA, free trade. People are impoverished. Look at Haiti. Look at how the USA intervened to bring down Aristide and ensure that the country maintained a free market economy. Nigeria, that's a country in Africa. And it is at this point the top oil exporting country on the African continent. Nigeria has been doing business with Wall Street, Chevron, Shell Oil, BP. It's been doing business with them for years. And you'll notice that the country is a very, very poor country. At this point, the life expectancy is quite low. Illiteracy is approaching 42%, from my understanding. Nigeria is not very wealthy in terms of the population, but it is a rich country. It's got lots of oil, but the people there are poor. Libya used to be the top oil exporting country on the African continent, but at this point, Libya is a mess. Libya used to have the highest life expectancy on the African continent as well, but NATO went in and bombed the place into ruin. Look at Iraq. This is another country that was bombed into ruin and chaos. Look at Afghanistan. When these countries become absorbed into this international system, when they join with capitalism and with the global financial system dominated by these banks and corporations, they don't become any wealthier. There's this mythology. We hear that these corporations are developing the world. We've heard this before, right? The corporations are developing the world. They're helping bring people out of poverty. All the places that are dominated by these Wall Street banks and corporations tend to be deeply, deeply poor. And if you'll notice, there's a term for those who study economics. They might understand the phrase monopolistic stagnation, right? Because if you look at these countries that are independent, that are being attacked, who does the USA not like right now? Who's on the USA's enemy list?
Venezuela.
Right. So we got Venezuela, right? That's an independent state-run oil company selling oil on the international markets in competition with Wall Street. You got Iran, another country with an independent state-run oil company selling oil in competition with Chevron, BP, and these big corporations. What else? We got Russia, a huge state-run corporation exporting on the international markets in competition with Wall Street. It's about clearing the world. It's about maintaining a monopoly, right? The oil in Saudi Arabia is basically under control of Western corporations, so there's no problem. Notice that we're not seeing big outcry about human rights in Saudi Arabia. All these groups that are leading protests against Iran or leading protests against Venezuela, they're a little silent about the Saudi monarchy. One of the only countries in the world that still cuts people's heads off in public. The weird thing about all of this is there was a time when this setup around the world was pretty beneficial to lots of Americans, right? They went around attacking independent countries. They bombed Korea, bombed Vietnam, but we had the highest life expectancy in the world. We had, this booming economy. We had the American dream, the house and the car. But now, the same thing that they did to Latin America, the same thing that they did to Asia and Africa, they're doing it to Pennsylvania. They're doing it to Ohio. They're doing it to Michigan. They're doing it all over the United States right now. I was doing some research. They're actually unpaving the roads in 27 different states right now. They have a machine, and it's called a reclaimer. And what they do is they go to roads that are asphalt. They pull up the asphalt, they pulverize it, and they redistribute it. And where you used to have a paved road, at this point you have a dirt road. They're pulverizing, they're unpaving the roads in 27 different states because cities and municipalities can no longer afford to pay for paved roads, right? We are unpaving roads. Now, I'm not claiming to be a brilliant economist. I'm not some PhD. I'm not a brilliant economist, but it doesn't take a genius to realize that if you're replacing paved roads with dirt roads, there's a big problem in the economy. Now, Donald Trump says that unemployment is at record low levels. You know what's also at record low levels? Wages. Wages are at record low levels. And you know what's at record high levels? Household debt. The rate of household debt in the United States is higher than it has ever been. People all across the United States are in debt. Something is deeply wrong. The same big banks and corporations that were controlling China's economy back in 1927 and keeping this proud civilization deeply impoverished, those same corporations are at this point dominating and destroying the economy of the United States. This is a reality we need to understand. And for the Chinese people, a people with such a proud history, you have to understand how humiliating this was. In a lot of the parks in China, they actually had signs. These parks were reserved for the European businessmen. And they actually had signs in these parks that said, no dogs or Chinese allowed. Right? In the parks in China, that they were not allowed in their own parks. This was deep humiliation. But China's quite a different country today, isn't it? You know, back when this document was written, back in 1927, China did not have a single steel mill. Not a single steel mill. Today, China produces half of the steel in the entire world. When this document was written, China did not have telephone service. Most of the country did not have telephones. Today, China has the largest telecommunications manufacturer in the entire world. You know, the world tourism industry is having a boom because in places like London and Paris and this city, New York, a big tourist city, there's a whole new market of tourists coming in. And you know who these people are? These are the grandchildren of those peasants that Mao was writing about. These people that were starving and hungry and illiterate, their grandchildren are now going on vacation to places like Paris and London and New York City. You can see them on the streets of this city. 700 million people have been raised out of poverty in China since 1949. 700 million people. Now, there's still a lot of poverty in China. At this point, 30 million people in China still live in poverty. 30 million. And their goal by 2020, as part of their vision of building what they call a moderately prosperous socialist society, is to completely eliminate poverty in China and bring those remaining 30 million people out of poverty. Now, China's got a huge amount of problems. They've got a huge issue of corruption. People talk about human rights, and you know, they are very clear about one thing, which is that they have no desire to spread their system around the world. You don't like the Chinese political model? Don't worry, it's not coming here. It'll never come here. But the way, and this is why it's relevant to this conversation, the way that these 700 million people were lifted out of poverty, it wasn't with capitalism. It was with socialist methods. I'll give you an example. You know, in China they declared the new laws regarding electric cars. The government went to all the auto manufacturers in China, and it said to them, you know, 1 out of every 10 cars that you produce must be an electric car. And they didn't just say this to the domestic car makers. They actually said this to anyone who imports cars into China. They said, if you import cars into China, you can't have cars that run on fossil fuels. 1 out of every 10 cars that you produce cannot run on fossil fuels. And next year, that's going to be 2 out of every 10 cars. And pretty soon, it's going to be 3 out of every 10 cars. And right now, the metals that are used in the production of the batteries in electric cars, those rare metals, are going through the roof on the stock market because people are desperate to get them. Now, the article about China's new energy vehicle regulations that was in the Wall Street Journal, the first sentence of it, they said, by sheer force of will, China has created the world's largest electric car market. Sheer force of will, right? And that's the reality. The government went to these car manufacturers, said, this is what you're going to do, and they did it. Now, this is starting to get to the essence of the difference between socialism and capitalism. In capitalism, the government works for the corporations, and that's how it is over here. They would never make such car rules here. The automakers would never stand for it. The big oil companies would never tolerate it. But in China, instead of the government being controlled by the corporations are controlled by the government, and that's a big difference. There's a lot of confusion about what capitalism is. I made a video talking about how Mexico is capitalist, and I got all these people explaining to me that Mexico could not be capitalist because it's poor, and everyone knows capitalism means rich. You know, there's a lot of brilliance on the libertarian side of things, but I'm not going to get into that. But there's a lot of confusion, and socialism too, right? What is socialism? I've heard people say, well, the USA is socialist because we've got a post office, right? That makes us a socialist country, right? And there's all kinds of confusion about this kind of stuff. Well, I'm going to give you a clear definition. Capitalism is a system in which the economy functions for the purpose of making profits for a group of owners. Karl Marx, he talked about the anarchy of production. Frederick Engels, he wrote that under capitalism, the means of production only function as a preliminary transformation into capital. Mao, he talked about how under capitalism, it's profits in command. A great example is, Dakota was in Union Square, like around the holiday time, I believe, when we had record low temperatures here in this city. And he saw that all these, these stores, like Burlington Coat Factory and some of the stores down there, they were cutting up clothing. They were cutting up these warm winter coats and throwing them into the garbage. And the reason that they were cutting them up, and you would think, it's freezing temperatures, you've got people outside that are cold, why are they cutting them up before they throw them away? Isn't this a big waste? Well, it's not a waste, because those coats weren't produced for the purpose of keeping people warm. Those coats were produced for the purpose of making profits for a group of owners. So if they threw them into the garbage and someone took them out, that would be a coat that they did not buy from the store owner, right? Or you can, I mean, there's other examples. You can talk about, a lot of restaurants in New York City. At the end of the night, they'll take the excess food, they'll throw it into the garbage, and then before they walk away, they'll pour a bunch of motor oil on top of it. So no homeless person can take it out of the garbage, right? Again, they didn't produce that food so people can eat it. They produced that food so that they could make a profit from it. Sellability, not usability. That's capitalism. I mean, why do you think it is that pharmaceutical companies were working so hard to pressure doctors to overprescribe opioid medications to make profits? Why do you think it is that all over the country there are companies that are not hiring law-abiding citizens and just functioning outside of the jails, but instead they're going into the prisons and hiring prisoners to do the work and paying them 2 cents an hour, taking jobs away from people on the outside? What's that about? It's about making profits. Capitalism is the rule of profits. It's an economy that functions in the interest of profits. Well, socialism. Socialism is when the economy functions to serve the country. Socialism is a planned economy. It's when the people of a country come together and take control of their economy and force it to work in the interest of the public. That's the difference between capitalism and socialism. That's the definition that I can agree on. People have asked me what socialism would be like in the United States. I've given them 4 basic steps. Number 1. Right now, we're having a huge boom on the oil and energy markets, right? At this point, because of hydraulic fracking, we're producing more oil than most of the world. I believe we're 3rd in terms of oil production in the world, and we're the top natural gas producer in the entire world. We're having a boom right now. Our country is very, very wealthy in terms of natural resources, but yet we're getting poorer. And in fact, a lot of the states that have the most of this natural gas are some of the poorest states, the states that are hardest hit by deindustrialization, Pennsylvania, Michigan. Well, one first step toward moving the country towards socialism would be doing what most countries, or a lot of countries, have done around the world, and nationalizing our natural resources. Oil, natural gas, coal, timber. The profits from the land of the United States of America should go to the people of the United States of America. Governments that are bankrupt while we've got a huge boom in oil and natural gas. It shouldn't be going on like that. The profits should go to the country. Number 2, right now, all across the United States, like I mentioned, roads are being unpaved. Water isn't being properly purified. People are drinking lead in their water, contaminated water. Look at the MTA. It's in complete disrepair. Well, what we need right now is a mass program of infrastructure reconstruction. All these young people stuck in low-wage, short-term jobs should get hired and paid a decent wage to start rebuilding the highways and the bridges, revamping our universities, building a healthier country. We should put the next generation to work. Give them bright green uniforms. Say they're the Army of American Rebirth, and put them out there building high-speed rail and new highways. Let's rebuild the United States. Roosevelt did it during the Great Depression. There's no reason that our current leaders can't do it. That's step number 2. Step number 3. Right before he died, Franklin Delano Roosevelt put forward the idea that we needed an economic Bill of Rights. We have the Bill of Rights, the right to free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, but we ought to have an economic Bill of Rights. People ought to have the right to see a doctor when they're sick. People ought to have the right to have a decent home to live in. People ought to have the right to an education. Right? This is basic. This is what Roosevelt called for, and he said that this was a way to safeguard democracy. Roosevelt famously said that hungry stomachs are what dictatorships are made from, and that in order to safeguard democracy and freedom, you have to make sure that people are cared for. That if you don't want to have some kind of authoritarian nightmare, you need to provide for people. That'd be step number 3, Roosevelt's economic Bill of Rights. And step number 4, banking. Now, maybe you don't want to read Karl Marx, maybe you think that stuff's a little too radical. That's fine. You can read an obscure document people don't really read much these days. It's called the Constitution of the United States. And the Constitution of the United States says that only the federal government has the right to print money. Only the federal government has the right to print money. Well, that's been gotten rid of. Right now we have a private corporation, the Federal Reserve, that is printing our money. And for every dollar that they print, we are getting even more deeper in debt. And like I said, maybe Karl Marx, all that stuff's a little too radical for you. Well, read the Bible, or read the Torah, or read the Quran. Every major religion forbids usury, lending money at interest. capitalism is great because you can work hard and get ahead, right? We've heard that before. You work hard and get ahead. Well, I've got news for you folks, that lending money at interest is having money. It's getting money by having money. That is not working hard to get ahead. And what it leads to, the reason that every civilization in history has warned against it, is because it leads to a creditor class that has more money than everybody else and rules over society. And that's what we're dealing with right now. At this point, all of our governments are in debt. We're completely beholden to these bankers that have control over our economy, right? Well, I think that the lending of money should be in the hands of the community. Somebody wants to open a business. Instead of going to some banker, they should go to the community and make a case that their business or their community or their business or their project will be beneficial to the entire community. And if they determine that, we'll lend them the money to do it. And then when they start paying back their loan, the interest or the revenue will go into the state budget. And we can build more hospitals and more schools and make sure we have decent roads and Amtraks and all kinds of things, right? So those are the 4 steps. Those are the 4 steps. Take control of our oil and natural resources, infrastructure development, pass the Economic Bill of Rights of Roosevelt, and control of our banking system. That's socialism. Now, notice that doesn't sound very radical, does it? That doesn't sound too radical. There's no blood in the streets. No one's getting killed here. There's no Russian guys in fur hats who are showing up at your house and saying, "This place now belongs to the government." None of that. I'm sorry. I'm not a socialist because I want to destroy the United States of America. That's not what I'm in this for. I'm a socialist because I want to save the United States of America. I got to tell you, the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution just happened. And there's a lot of eulogizing of that time going on across the United States right now and across the world. People were all kind of giving homage. People behaved very heroically during the Russian Revolution. But if you look at what was going on at that point, that was a kill or be killed situation. People were starving to death. People were miserable. I don't want things to get to that point in the United States of America. When you're 15, you want to be Che Guevara, you want to be a hero, what's one thing? But in reality, I don't want anything like that to happen. I want to save this country from some kind of violent catastrophe. I don't want us ever to get in a situation where those kind of events are going on. Things were quite hard during that time period. We don't want to get there. No rational person wants to live through events like that, where you have death on that large of a scale and that many people that are suffering and dying. Let's be clear about that. Let's be rational. The glorification of violence, that's something that every serious revolutionary has always rejected. Punchism, adventurism, ultra-leftism. Serious revolutionaries, they don't glorify that kind of thing. And you can read that. Revolutions, violent revolutions, are kill or be killed situations where people have no choice. When people are forced to take up arms, they have no choice. They're fighting for their lives. They're fighting for their communities. It's a nightmarish situation that none of us want to be involved in. We want to save our country. We want to get to the point that we can have a decent society. This document was written at a time the Chinese Communist Party had a very different way of operating. Mao's writing about the peasants, but at the time this document was written, the Chinese Communist Party focused almost exclusively on the people in the cities. They got their orders from Moscow, from the Communist International, and they were operating in the cities, and they were functioning kind of as a wing of the nationalist KMT movement in China. And that's what they were doing. And Mao went to the Hunan province, and he wrote this document. And this document is actually kind of a wild polemic. If you read it, there's a lot of really, really fiery rhetoric, a lot of anger, not at the government, not at society, but at his own comrades. He's yelling at them almost. I'm going to read you some of what else he wrote. He wrote, "When the masses are in motion, there are 3 alternatives: to march at their head and lead them, to trail behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, or stand in their way and oppose them. Every Chinese is free to choose, but events will force you to choose quickly. If your revolutionary viewpoint is firmly established, if you've been to villages and looked around, you will undoubtedly feel thrilled as never before. Countless thousands of the enslaved peasants are striking down enemies who have battened their flesh. This change that is taking place now is an important factor in the completion of the revolution. Every revolutionary comrade must support it, or he will be walking and taking a stand of counter-revolution." Now, Now, he writes these words, you can hear just the burning anger. Because no one was more Chinese than Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was Chinese up and down. He was the walking incarnation, and he knew that the Chinese Revolution was not going to come from the 1 or 2% of the population that was based in the cities. It was going to come from the 90% that were operating in the countryside. And the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party didn't want to hear that because they were too busy obeying the orders of folks in Moscow who told them to do something else. Well, you know, history has a way of operating, as we know. A few months after this document was written, Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party changed their position, were no longer aligned with the Chinese Communist Party, started killing all the communists. So then the communists had to flee, and where did they flee, of course? They fled to the countryside, and pretty soon Mao was leading the Chinese Communist Party. And the interesting thing about it is, numerous times throughout the 1930s, Moscow tried to fire Mao as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Many times they wrote letters saying, you know, we've appointed somebody else to run the party, and they just ripped that up, right? Mao was the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and that's how it was. And it was the peasants that made the revolution in China. And that's the reality. That's what happened. But when Mao wrote this document, he was a voice crying out in the wilderness. He was speaking the truth and speaking common sense, and he was doing it at a time where people just didn't want to hear it. And that's what's so beautiful, and that's why that document is considered one of Mao's most important essays. That's why it's studied all over China now, is because this was a turning point. He took the Chinese Revolution in the direction that ultimately led to the victory of socialism in China. Now, folks, I had a grandfather who was a huge baseball fan, right? Anyone know I have a relative who was just really into baseball? They just love baseball. My grandfather was a huge baseball fan. In fact, he used to call me Slats. He'd be like, hey, Slats, how you doing there? Good to see you, Slats. I didn't realize this. Apparently this is a reference to some 1950s shortstop or catcher or something like that. I didn't know that. But he loved baseball. But he had my grandfather in a room with another big baseball fan. They'd be sitting there, and pretty soon they'd be talking about statistics that I couldn't understand. They'd be talking about dates and players and names we've never heard of. People call that inside baseball. You know, it's the kind of thing where if you're not part of that little subculture, you don't really understand it. It doesn't make any sense to you. Inside baseball, right? If you're not part of this little enclave of people, you know, you don't really understand it. No one likes to listen to inside baseball. If you're not part of the little community where people are using these words and phrases, you just kind of feel left out, and it kind of doesn't make you feel well to hear what they call inside baseball. Well, I'm going to work very hard to make sure that this next part of my presentation is not inside baseball. Now, they've done polls. People have probably seen these polls. They say about 30% of the U.S. public believes in socialism at this point, right? 30%. Among millennials, it's actually about 50%. And we got plenty of socialist groups in the United States. Like we got the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the International Socialist Organization. We got the RCP and the ISO and the QWH and the XYZ and the GW. I mean, we got more parties than you can imagine, right? We got more parties than you can possibly imagine. And we don't just have parties. We got a lot of leagues, right? We got committees. We got internationals, right? There's about 5 4th internationals. There's a 5th international. Maybe there's going to be a 6th or an 8th or a 12th international. Right? We got loads of socialist groups. But forgive me if I'm stepping on toes here, but let's be real. None of these groups mean jack shit. Sorry, I hate to tell you that. I hate to be a bit of a jerk, but it's the reality, right? None of these groups really mean anything. You know, not only did I go to the World Festival of Youth and Students with Alex and Dakota and others, this recent one, but one of the most meaningful experiences that I ever had was going to the World Festival of Youth and Students in Quito, Ecuador in 2013. But at that time, I was part of a smaller, irrelevant socialist group, but I got to go to the World Festival of Youth and Students in Ecuador. And at that point, you know, I got to meet with people from around the world, people who called themselves socialists, communists, and revolutionaries. They were a lot different than the socialists and communists and revolutions in the United States. I mean, I met with folks from Angola, folks from Zimbabwe, folks from Venezuela, folks from India, Russia, China, places like that. And these folks were just a completely different breed than the folks that I was working with in the United States. It was like night and day. In the United States, if you believe in socialism, you basically have two choices. Two choices, right? On the one hand, you can be burning the American flag, selling lots of newspapers, and screaming about Trotsky, and be irrelevant, and be just somebody that most of American society looks at and just says, I'm just going to go the other way. Or, to be fair, you have another option. Now, the other option is you can be in groups that function within their local Democratic Party clubs, folks who watch MSNBC religiously, and when it gets down to it, socialism is something they talk about once a year, on May Day, maybe they read some Marx. When it gets down to it, they're urging the Bernie-crats to just shut up and vote for Hillary and calm down, and at the end of the day, they're just functioning as Democrats, and maybe socialism is just something they put on the back burner. Those are your two options. That's what you can be if you can be a socialist. You can be irrelevant and extreme, or you can just kind of give up on your ideals and function as part of a party that you don't believe in, but hold on to socialism is something you put on the back burner. Those are your two choices, right? But when I met with socialists from Ecuador, and socialists from Venezuela, and socialists from India, socialists from China, Vietnam, places like that, I was meeting with folks that didn't fit either of these categories. Now, these folks were serious revolutionaries. You could talk to them up and down about Marx and Lenin, and they could tell you in depth, in great detail, about how they were working to try and build socialism in their country. And these folks, in addition to being dedicated and serious and very dedicated to what they believed in, these folks were also not irrelevant. They had seats in parliament. They had huge swaths of territory they controlled. In some places like Vietnam and in China and Angola, they were actually running the government. They were the ruling party. These people weren't irrelevant extremists, and they weren't sellouts and phonies. They were actually leading their country and trying to develop, make their country wealthier. And that was kind of a surprise for me. Now, I was always taught, that in a setting like this, you never really want to talk about yourself, right? No one came here tonight because they want to hear some white male go on about his own life. That's not why you're here, so I'll be very brief. I'm originally from Ohio. Grew up in a very small town of about 10,000 people. And it's a very Republican town, almost entirely white. And, I remember, one thing that I remember very distinctly is there were certain people in my town who every day they wore shirts with religious slogans on them. This one kid had a shirt that said, "Caution, God at work, do not proceed without a Bible." This other kid had a shirt with like a bloody nail on it. It's like, his life was not pointless and neither is yours. And I used to hate these kids. I'm like, do they have to preach at us every day? Like, what is the problem, Well, I look back on myself and kind of being annoyed with these religious shirts, and I feel kind of guilty because I realized the reason that these kids were wearing religious shirts every day, it wasn't because they wanted to preach at me. It was because these were the only shirts they had. Their parents could get these shirts for free at the local evangelical Christian churches. And so that's what they were wearing. There were a lot of kids in my town who grew up in trailers. I grew up thinking that I was rich because both of my parents had college degrees and they were both working. I never remember them being unemployed throughout my childhood. And, I'll tell you, I discovered all of this on my own. I first read the Communist Manifesto when I was in 5th grade. It was at the local library where my mom worked. I read it. I did not understand it, but the tone of it appealed to me. Workers of the world unite. I was excited about it, I started getting involved in more socialist and revolutionary groups when I was in college. And when the financial crisis hit, when the financial crisis came, I was there. I was just like, this is it. This proves it, right? The economy of the United States needs to be reorganized to serve the public. The time has come. We need to go out and organize. The polls were coming out. People were upset with capitalism. It was time to go. I was finished with college. I was living in Cleveland. And the folks in this socialist group I was in were just always telling me, calm down, Caleb, calm down. It's not, it's not the end of the world. Come to a rally every so often, but you got to chill out. Get another hobby or something. Go to a rally every so often, but you don't have to give yourself to this. You don't have to be so passionate. I just thought that was so odd. And I'll never forget, and the reason I'll never forget is because it was my birthday, December 30th, 2010. I packed up very few of my belongings that I had, some clothes, some old socialist books, packed them into a suitcase. I came to this city on a Greyhound bus, December 30th, 2010. And those were hard times before I moved to New York City. I remember, I was always working in gas stations. I am just not a very good gas station attendant. I have absolute respect for folks who can do those jobs well. I am not one of those people. I just couldn't do it. I remember selling my blood plasma on the east side of Cleveland. And I would think, this used to be, this prosperous center of the steel industry. And here, every day, there's a line of hundreds of people lined up to sell their blood plasma to get an extra $30 for the week, right? And that's what capitalism has done. But regardless, those were not good times. I came to this city on a Greyhound bus. A lot has happened since 2010. Right? Occupy Wall Street has happened. I've traveled the world. I've been to Iran. I've been to Venezuela. I've been to Russia. I gave a speech in Brazil to thousands of union workers about how Wall Street is manipulating the oil prices and was dropping the oil prices to hurt independent countries around the world. I participated in a humanitarian mission trying to get to Yemen and deliver humanitarian aid to Yemen as Saudi Arabia was bombing and killing people in that country. And at this point I work for an international TV network, and I report the news as a journalist, and I do it in a way that I can guarantee you that the Wall Street elite does not like. I'm in a good spot. But, most people that'll give you a story like that, they'll tell you, see, that's how great capitalism is, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? We're going to work hard, right? Bullshit. Bullshit. Tell you, if you get any group of young people together, you're going to get people that are working 6 or 7 hours behind a counter with a manager driving them to work harder the entire time. And at the end of that 6 or 7 hour shift, in which they're constantly being pushed to get better stats at the cash register, sweep those floors faster, at the end of that 6 or 7 hour shift, what happens then? Do they finally get to go home and have a beer and rest? Oh no. That's when they take their laptop and they take their backpack and they go to class, right? And they run up more student debt. Another rip-off scheme for these billionaires to do. They're trying to just get a chance at the middle-class lifestyle their parents had, that American dream that you could get if you just work hard, right? They're trying to get a chance at it. They wonder why there's so many school shootings, right? They wonder why people are killing themselves at record rates. They wonder why there's an opioid epidemic here in the United States right now. They wonder why so many people are feeling insecure. I'll tell you what it is. I'll tell you what's killing the millennial generation. All these questions, what's wrong with the millennials? I'll tell you what is killing the millennial generation right now. It's the greed of Wall Street billionaires. It's the psychopathic power of money. Yeah. Now, again, I'm going to bore you all with another personal story, but I'm making a point. It's not just about me. I remember, during the height of the Occupy Wall Street protests, I was a member of one of these small, irrelevant socialist groups. And I remember that, it was quite exciting to be at Occupy Wall Street. There's so many young people that are so interested in socialism, so passionate. And it got to be a problem because, the literature that my socialist group had was a little bit off. They had a pamphlet about the Carter administration and how during the reign of Jimmy Carter, the generals were over the White House, and exposing the Carter administration. That got to be a little embarrassing to sell to people in their teens and 20s. Yeah. They also had a pamphlet about how Ronald Reagan was paving the road to fascism. They had that. That was a little interesting. And of all the literature they had nothing that just explained socialism in just kind of clear terms like I'm doing tonight. There was nothing that kind of just put these ideas forward. So I went to the leaders of the group and I said, why don't we put something out that just kind of explains socialism? All these young people who don't know anything about socialism, let's just explain it to them in some literature. So I wrote a draft of it, showed it to the leaders of the group, right? They read it over and they said, well, you got to change this, this, and this. And I said, sure, we changed that. 5, 6, 7 drafts. They liked it. It was all set to go. We printed about 200 copies of it, stapled, folded, a beautiful, nice cover. It was all ready to go out. And the night before I was about to start distributing this pamphlet, I got a phone call. My phone rang, and it was somebody who was a founder of the organization who was at that point about 75 years old. And she called me and she said, Caleb, I hear that you wrote this pamphlet that you're going to distribute to the occupiers. I said, yeah. She said, yeah, this isn't happening. And I said, well, what's the problem? I said, is it politically? Is there something we need to adjust? So it's the correct political line, and that, it shows that we're the true descendants of Lenin and Trotsky. And all. No. No, it's actually very good, she said. I read through it. Everything you wrote is amazingly correct, and everything has been adjusted and all that. And I said, okay. I said, what's the issue? And she said, something like this needs to be written by an important leader of the organization. Somebody like me or Fred ought to write something like this. And I said, really? I said, well, would you like me to take my name off of it? Is that the issue? I could just, take my name off so it's just like on behalf of the group. It doesn't represent an individual. She said, oh, no. I don't want you to take your name off of it. I just want you to destroy every copy of this. And I said to her, well, isn't it a problem that we don't have any literature that, explains basic socialist politics? And And she said, yeah, you know, Fred or I, we're going to get around to it eventually, you know. There you go. Now, that story is not unfamiliar. Anyone who's been in any socialist group is familiar with stories like that. The left is dysfunctional in some very, very weird ways. And you know, if you see this socialist group out there, they're still selling pamphlets about the evils of the Jimmy Carter administration. It's very interesting. What's going on there? Is this an accident? You got to ask yourself these questions. But, you know, the thing is, I feel like what we need right now is we need as many voices as possible speaking up against capitalism. It's not actually that hard. Alex, what's wrong with capitalism?
It pushes so many people into debt.
Okay. Dakota, what's wrong with capitalism?
There's 11 empty houses for every homeless person.
Maddie, what's wrong with capitalism?
It's a drug addiction.
What's wrong with capitalism, Paul?
Oh, it makes you work so hard for so little.
Joe, what is wrong with capitalism?
It's an irrational system, an irrational world, basically.
Oh. I want 1,000 voices saying this. I want 1,000,000 voices saying this. I want a chorus of anti-capitalist agitation that is so loud it shakes the foundations of this country. You know, we need to build a kind of organization that is reflective of the kind of society that we want to build, where every voice is included, where every person is unleashed to fulfill their potential and make a contribution to the revolutionary movement. And you know what? We are going to totally remake this country right now. We are going to build high-speed trains through the Midwest. We are going to achieve full employment for all. We are going to achieve health care for all. We are going to build an entirely new country in the United States. I think that it's very possible that we could make the United States into the kind of thing people have only dreamed of and read about in science fiction novels. We can unleash artificial intelligence. We can do so much if we get rid of the rule of profits. That's the problem. The rule of profits is in the way of the future of the human race. Now, I want to just quickly close with this. If you study American history, at the time, in the lead up to the American Revolution, about 40, 50 years before the American Revolution, there was a mass movement that they called the Great Awakening. And it was a religious movement, but back then people thought about politics in the terms of religion, right? It was like back then people had only ever read one book, it was the Bible, you know, and people thought in terms of religion. And before the people of the colonies were ready to awaken and have a revolution against the British, they had to awaken the consciousness first. And you saw that expressed in kind of a mass religious movement. And before the Civil War in this country, or what Marxists call the Second American Revolution, there was also, you know, about 40 years before, there was a mass awakening of consciousness, a second Great Awakening. And this was essentially people that, you know, that they realized something was wrong in the country. And all the religious groups that go back to that time, a lot of our culture as Americans, like the song Amazing Grace, the Mormons, the Seventh-day Adventists, they all go back to that period. Tent revivalism comes back from that period. But all of that was abolitionist. All of them agreed that like slavery was wrong and it violated their moral beliefs, and that was part of the Second Great Awakening. Well, we're a much more secular society. You know, we're not expressing ourselves in terms of religion. We're not living in revolutionary times right now. I mean, you know, we're not living in a moment where socialism is going to come tomorrow. But I think it's fair to say that what we're living in right now would be, I would call it the beginning, the early stages of the great socialist awakening of the United States of America. The minds of people in the USA are starting to change. People are at the point where they're starting to realize, you know, this rule of profits, this rule of the dollar is wrong. Something is wrong in our country. Something's wrong when these big corporations are getting rich while we're getting poorer. And you know, I'll never forget, you know, I was a salesman when I was in college. I would call up you know, the alumni fund and ask them to contribute. And I'll never forget, I called up this one fellow and asked him to contribute to the alumni fund. I remember he said to me, he said, son, why are you calling me on the phone? He said, I haven't got a pot to piss in at this university. I mean, well, how can you call me on the phone and ask me to donate to my alma mater? I haven't got a pot to piss in. And I said to him, well, you know, I mean, here at the university, we have many public restrooms that are always available to our alumni. We would just like to specify the time and date. You can come by and use our facilities. He thought this was hilarious. He was just cracking up, and you know what? He donated like $30 to the alumni fund, right? He's a salesman. You know, I must admit, I kind of respect the Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't agree with them, but they're out on the subways every day promoting their thing. I remember when I was a kid, I'd get a knock on my door. Hello, you know, we're from the Jehovah's Witnesses. Check out the Watchtower. You know, they're promoting their ideas. We need people knocking on doors all throughout the United States saying, you know why there's an opioid crisis? You know why they're unpaving your roads? It's because of capitalism. It's because of the greed of Wall Street bankers. That's what we need. We need a mass awakening of the consciousness. You know, there's all these progressive candidates running for office, And, for years when I was a leftist, I always said, break with the Democrats, break with the Democratic Party. Well, right now the Democratic Party is breaking with itself. There's a fight going on inside the Democratic Party where your average Democrat who believes in wanting to make the country better is seeing that their party has been hijacked by a clique of Hillary Clinton and John Podesta and people like that have a very, very different agenda. And if you're doing what I used to do, where you stand on the outside and shout, break with the Democratic Party, you're not going to be in on that fight. And this is the important time. There's a division going on. People within the Democratic Party itself are waking up and not agreeing with how their party is run and questioning things. And the question is, are you going to be outside of that conversation or are you going to be inside of it? And I think that's a conversation people need to have. But at this point, and I said before, I don't want a violent revolution. But turn on your TV. Charlottesville, Baltimore. The capitalists are doing a pretty good job of moving us toward a violent revolution all by themselves. They don't need any socialists to do that. Things are getting pretty scary in the United States of America. There's a lot of confusion out there, a lot of fear. A lot of insecurity. People think that their problems are caused by immigrants from Mexico or Islam or Mexicans or space aliens or reptile people or, we've heard it all. Well, the reality is that the problems in the United States are caused by the greed of Wall Street bankers and the drive of small clique of people to make profits. And the time has come to start preaching jobs, democracy, equality, basic human values that all of us want, as the billionaires and monopolists are destroying the future of our country. It's time for the United States to be reborn. American rebirth.